The honourable member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be splitting my time with the Conservative House Leader. So really what I want to talk today about is three key issues. And the first one, as the previous speaker just talked about, is accountability. Next, the actions we need to take in order to better understand where the process failed and how do we collectively move forward. And finally, I will hint on or talk about leadership and unfortunate leadership failure dealing with this situation. So let's talk about the accountability aspects first, Mr. Speaker, for both the Prime Minister and the Minister of National Defence. This government has gone to great lengths to talk about ministerial accountability. I agree. Being accountable includes taking ownership of your respective department, office, or staff. When we talk about the Minister of National Defence, he is the one responsible for the whole of the department, including being the direct supervisor of the Chief of Defence Staff and the Ombudsman. He's talked at length about not interfering politically and respecting the independence of any investigation. I fully agree. And I've been personally very vocal about this current Prime Minister's political interference historically with the independence of the prosecution and judiciary, in particular with the SNC-Lavalin affair, and how this was a great failure and should have never happened. However, in the case that we're debating today, the minister has forgot that as the direct supervisor of both the Chief of Defence Staff and Ombudsman, this goes beyond just the political realm. Further, there's a fundamental difference in ensuring an investigation occurs and in interfering in said investigation or even doing the investigation themselves. The parliamentary secretary in her speech earlier during the debate, as other Liberal members have stated, that this Liberal government apparently followed the exact same process as the previous Conservative government. This is absolutely false. Under the previous Conservative government, both the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service and the National Security Advisor were both involved, and investigations actually did occur in response to rumors. This didn't happen at all in this current case with this current Liberal government. The only thing was a passing of the buck to the PCO and the clerk of the Privy Council, and nothing further occurred despite actually having an actual allegation presented to the Ombudsman. In fact, the only thing that did occur was the Chief of Defence Staff getting his mandate extended, getting a promotion, getting a raise, not a promotion, but a raise, and becoming eventually the longest serving Chief of Defence Staff in history. Bottom line, the Minister of National Defence admitted on the 12th of March in committee that he was responsible for the failures of these allegations being investigated, and the minister is accountable. However, really what we're here today and what the motion today before us is to debate the lack of accountability in the Prime Minister's office. I've had the fortune and privilege of commanding hundreds of Canada's finest. I've been a chief of staff both in Afghanistan and Iraq, along with holding key other staff appointments. When I was in charge, I always reminded my staff that I could only do my job if they kept me in the loop. The line I used to use was, I can only stop the manure from rolling downhill if I know about it. If I don't know about it, it's really hard to stop it. However, when I was the chief of staff, my primary job was to keep the boss, keep the commander in the loop. And this is what we're really talking about today. So in fact, within the minister or the MND, we all know that in this specific case that the Minister of National Defence's office, the Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff all knew about sexual misconduct allegations, yet somehow were to be led to believe that the Prime Minister himself didn't know. Based on this, I think we're only faced with two possible conclusions. One, the Prime Minister did know about these allegations, or either his Chief of Staff failed to do her job to keep the Prime Minister in the loop. Either way, it speaks to incompetence within the Prime Minister's office, and as a result, the victims of sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces are suffering as a result of these leadership failures. Next, I want to focus on briefly on the way ahead and why it's so important that these failures to hold those accountable are so important to the members of the Canadian Armed Forces. I've been hearing from countless former colleagues within the forces They are primarily concerned about the senior leadership, both politically and militarily, being held to account. They are concerned that if we don't fix these and we don't understand where those actual failures occurred, there is no moving forward. We can ultimately put any process in place, but if somehow the senior leadership, especially the senior leadership politically, refuses to take action, then I don't know how, and they don't believe anything is going to change moving forward. It's been talked about before. We have the Canadian Armed Forces has the Deschamps report. I was there when it came in, and frankly, I was shocked at the length and depth of some of the details that were occurred in that. And one of the first things that I did, being a serving member at the time, was talk to those colleagues of mine, those female or women colleagues, about is this true? Is there this much rampant sexual misconduct? And to be frank, I was shocked and disappointed that in so many cases that within the leadership of the Canadian Armed Forces that we were still allowing this to occur. I can only speak to the specific positions that I was in, and I did everything in my power, but at the same time, I fully admit I should have done more to create an atmosphere and an environment where anybody can come forward with any type of allegations. But ultimately, what we're debating today is that if these allegations, especially when they're against somebody like the Chief of Defense Staff, do not get properly investigated and concluded, this isn't about pronouncing guilt or innocence, this is about actually doing a proper investigation, then we can't move ahead. It's all about this cover-up that's creating all the problems. So I don't disagree with the previous members' comments that the Prime Minister and Minister of National Defense are ultimately responsible. However, in this case, if we take the Prime Minister at his word that he didn't know, ultimately he needs to now show leadership and make the tough choice and remove those within his office that are preventing him from doing his job as the Prime Minister. This is all about trust, Mr. Speaker, and about accountability. The members of the Canadian Armed Forces, and in particular the victims of sexual misconduct, harassment, need to know that they have the faith in both the senior political and military leadership in order to make sure this doesn't happen again going forward. I do agree with the member from North Island Powell River, more action is required, but first leaders, in this case, the Prime Minister, needs to show leadership, be accountable, and find out why this failure occurred from his Chief of Defense Staff. I'll leave my comments at that there, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to questions.
Questions and comments. We'll first go to the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as it's my first opportunity to enter into this discussion today, I'm particularly grateful the member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound focused on the larger issues that I wish we were talking about here today. I also think the honourable member for North Island Powell River made an absolutely fantastic speech, and I agree exactly with her sentiments. And to my honourable friend from Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound, I think that the Conservative motion is inappropriate and too narrowly focused on one individual and not the broader question. So I appreciate his raising SNC-Lavalin again. We never got to the bottom of that. Cabinet intervened to stop the RCMP from fully investigating if an obstruction of justice had occurred, and some of the same questions were at play there. Why was the Prime Minister never properly briefed on the Shawcross Doctrine? Why did he not understand that his then Minister of Justice, the Honourable Member for Vancouver-Granville, had it right, and the various bought and paid for experts hired by SNC-Lavalin had it wrong? Would the Honourable Member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound agree with me that our time would be better spent on those issues than on this very partisan, rather mean-spirited motion we have before us today?
The Honourable Member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respectfully disagree with the assertion there. We need to get to the bottom of this. The Honourable Member brought up a number of key points and factors on other issues, other failures by this current Prime Minister and his team. And ultimately, I think it just speaks to why this motion finally needs to come forward, and he needs to either be held to account or he needs to make that tough decision and surround himself primarily with the Chief of Staff that is going to make sure he is properly briefed and properly prepared to do his job as Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you to my colleague, and also thank you for his service and the fact that he probably understands better than many of us how important to the CAF is accountability. And yes, we need to come up with some long-term fixes. There was some great recommendations that have been ignored, but the issue of accountability at the highest level, can he speak to that and the importance within our military?
The Honourable Member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that is the root of what my speech was about. It's all about being accountable. If, as a leader, both in this case, and it's where my greatest disappointment is in this specific case, I have huge disappointment in everybody that's involved in this, in particular with the Chief of Defense Staff. I don't understand how he felt he could be leading this charge from being in uniform and the hypocrisy of leading off honor and at the same time actually having allegations against him. But the failure of leadership by the Minister of National Defense, that lack of really wanting to be accountable for this is extremely frustrating, because I expect better from him. The same thing with the Prime Minister in this case, Mr. Speaker. He is owed by his team the facts and all the answers. And if he's not going to hold his team to account, then we're going to continue to face, and he's going to continue to face, additional, allegations, additional problems going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member from Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound for his important speech, and I deeply respect and enjoy working with him in this place. I'm just wondering if he could speak to something that I feel is immensely important in this debate, and that's the reality that right now in committee, this is where this work should be happening. Katie Telford should be in front of the committee. I think it's absolutely abhorrent that the Liberals are blocking that. Let's get the work done. So I'm just wondering if the member could speak to that.
Well, Member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Mr. Speaker, I 100% agree with that, with what the member from North Island Powell River has raised. I was so shocked yesterday, and shocked is the word, that the chair of the committee would cancel committee that was going to debate this. Having participated, or been in the committee room, not necessarily virtually, but not necessarily asking questions for the last number of defense committee sessions, I am disappointed, having served in uniform, at just the filibustering and the lack of focusing on what this issue is. It should be about getting answers. It's about figuring out the way ahead and not stalling something that's so important. So for all the victims of sexual misconduct and harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces.